Good afternoon. Today is part 4 in lesson planning, and if you've been following along, you know that so far we have talked about how to write a good objective and the differences between informal and formal assessments, different types of assessments, formative and summative, and today we're going to put it together and show how to write it in your lesson plan template. So, this is a common problem that I want to talk about again with objectives. Just some reminders. One of the problems that I see is that student teachers have a tendency to want to write what they're going to do. My plan this morning is to talk about rather than thinking about what the student is expected to learn. The student will. Another common problem is to talk about not what the student's going to be learning, but what the student is going to be doing. For example, the pre-service teacher might write, the learner will read chapter 4. That means that you're teaching them to read chapter 4. So one of the things that you have to be thinking about is what are they learning? They aren't learning to read chapter 4. They are learning something. And so one of the things that happens is that people think they get into thinking about, well, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And they forget thinking about what are they supposed to learn. So this is a great little chart that shows you how it all fits together. And this is just a reminder. Assessments actually have two types. Formative refers to a type of assessment that's used during instruction. It's not all, it can be graded, but it's usually not graded. It can be informal or formal. Formative. Informal can be just asking questions, playing games, walking around looking at their work, having students do hand signals. That's kind of popular too. And that's just a way of the informally checking to see who's paying attention, who's learning, who's not, so that you can adjust instruction accordingly. There's also a formal way to formatively assess. Like, for example, common practice is to give an exit ticket out the door. And if you've taught very long, you know that students, when they know that all they have to do is get that done and they get to leave, they don't necessarily pay a great deal of attention to the quality of their work. So it's not a good summative assessment, but it could be a way for you to kind of get a snapshot of what there is to do. Homework, that's a type of a formative assessment. And again, not all of these types of assessments are necessarily good ones, but it's just a way for you to try to get a feeling of how things are going. Notes are not assessments. However, people can use notes for assessments. So, for example, in the notes, if you wanted students to answer specific questions, and then you can look through those to see how they're doing with that. Summative assessment is formal, but it cannot, because of definition, be informal. So the purpose of summative is to come up with a way of finding out in the end, have they learned it? So this is like the big thing. Are we having a quiz at the end, a test, an essay, presentation? What are they doing to show that they've learned? So it is always the intent that matters. A lot of these things, like for instance, an essay isn't by definition a summative assessment. It could also be just a learning activity. A presentation, again, that's another example. So things, as a lesson designer, you decide as the designer of your lesson how these are used. Are they formative? Are they summative? How are you using it? So it's important to remember that not every activity that you plan is an assessment. Thank goodness I'm not assessed on everything I do, because I would be a complete and total failure on a lot of things if that were true. And all of us are that way. So think in terms of what are we using to assess and what are we using, for example, for practice. So some of the activities you're going to have in your classroom are not assessments, because students need practice and they need to be able to explore and have learning experiences. This is just a list of the different types of formative and summative, and how they different. Formative is during instruction, summative is after. But that doesn't mean like at the end of class when you do an exit slip. And so I think that's where a lot of the misconception comes in, and people think that, well, if it's at the end of the lesson, then it's summative. No, because often you're not finished with teaching that whole segment. So it comes at the end of the whole learning segment, or unit or chapter or whatever you're going to call it. Formative can be graded, but often it's not. It's just a way for you to get feedback on how students are doing. So there's just a lot of different ways. But when we talk about this sort of thing, it has to do with purpose. Formative and summative, how they greatly differ is just in purpose. So when do summatives occur? Well, clearly they're not going to occur every day, because we're not going to give students a test or a quiz every day. We are going to assess every day, and we're going to assess constantly. You should be constantly assessing. Every time you walk around the room and you see what the students are doing, you're looking to see how are they learning? How am I doing? How are we doing? So it's not reasonable to expect there's going to be a summative each lesson. However, you should think about the summative that's going to occur at the end of the learning segment or the unit. Whenever you've completed teaching them how to add one-digit numbers, or whenever you've completed your unit on the Civil War, then you're going to need to have a summative then. And so that's what you need to be thinking about. For example, if you know that at the end of what you're teaching, you're going to have students write an essay, and you will be looking at the essay to find out whether or not they got it, then how you teach and the types of practice exercises that you give are going to get you that way. So it's important to know what kind of summative is coming up. So I expect students to, even though they're not having a summative each day, they should have a summative described that's going to be coming up. Um, Now, sometimes there are summatives that are more frequent. For example, if you've divided your learning objective into sub-skills, frequently this happens in math. You want to work on this, and then you work on that, and then so if that you might have more frequent summative if that were the case. So let's take a look at the lesson plan template. Uh, we talked about curriculum standards and essential questions. And then in your template, you've got a place to write your learning objectives. It says use active verbs that are measurable. Yes, they're applicable. Sometimes not measurable, but observable, I think is a better term to use. Link to standards, so that means they have to be aligned. Think about your Bloom's and your Webb's depth of knowledge. Um, in the assessment evaluation section, we're going to put in a division between informal assessments and formal assessments, and then we divide further formative and summative only under formal. That is because informal assessments are always formative. So right now, in the assignment that you're going to have coming up, I'm going to ask you to just kind of disregard this section on knowing your learners. We're going to come back to that. And for the assignment that you've got coming up, you're going to need to be able to come up with your curriculum standard, an essential question, some learning objectives, and then you're going to fill in your informal, formal, and then your modifications. So the modifications is not just for special ed students, and I often get this is a real big problem because students will say to me, well, I don't have anybody in my class that's got an IEP or a 504. And that's not what this is about. This is about thinking about all the different types of learners that you've got. Uh, it doesn't matter if they've got an IEP or a 504. Let's pretend we lived in a world where there was no such thing as an IEP or a 504. Would you agree that even in that world, students are completely different? Of course they are. Some are going to struggle. Some have not been coming to school regularly and they've got academic gaps. You've got advanced learners. You've got students who finish really early and you've got to think of stuff they've got to do when they're going to finish. You've got students who are unmotivated. You've got the ESL and the ELL as a category, but you've got a lot of different things going on in your room. And so there's always going to be unmotivated learners. There's always going to be struggling learners. And so these are the types of things you need to be thinking about. So this is the rubric that goes along with the objectives section in your lesson plan. Notice that you want to make sure that the objective is written to show what students will learn and or be able to do within the lesson. You need to be using active verbs from Bloom's, Webb's Depth of Knowledge. So be looking at all of that that was in your last module. You want to state measurable criteria if you can, if it's applicable. What they're talking about there is where sometimes you might say 80% accuracy, 95% accuracy. When you're working in the cognitive domain, I don't find that as very necessary. I'm thinking mainly in the psychomotor domain that these are normally more type that you need. So that's why it says if it applies. And for you, it just really doesn't apply for most of the students that I teach because we work mainly in the cognitive domain. PE folks, you probably would be adding in some measurable criteria. Written to show that students will learn and be able to do, again, action verbs. So what they've added here is that it incorporates multiple domains of learning. And so you want to think about, do I have, for example, not just domains, because like I say, we almost always work in the cognitive domain rather than the psychomotor and the affective, but make sure that you've got a wide variety of objectives that do use Bloom's and Webb. And then for the assessments, you want to make sure that they are providing the evidence that you need to monitor the whole class learning, and they also need to align with the objectives and the state standards. What's been added here is that you want to make sure that you have strategically designed your assessments to include, ways to address individual needs and those of small groups of students that have specific needs. All of that is part of the rubric. And then, of course, specifically in modifications, you've got a modification where assessments are planned and they're aligned. You've got all these different types of folks that you can be thinking about when you come up with your modifications. So you also want to include a justification for the design based on previous learning or assessment data. But as far as that's from the rubric, and the rubric is great for us to have a way for your professors and supervisors to kind of give you some feedback and for us to compare how you're doing from one point in your academic career to another. But as far as what I look for, I'm looking for some things that really aren't on the rubric. For example, if you have more than one objective, I like for you to number the objectives. And the reason for that is you can see right here where this student has written, in order to assess objective 1 and 3, the student will describe blah, blah, blah. And again, in order to assess objective 2, in order to assess objective 4. So that this person is making sure that all objectives are being assessed and they're referencing those so that I can go back and look to see, okay, is that going to be a way to collect evidence on this? Over here, you can see that this person has been thinking about struggling readers, struggling writers in their assessment. That's very good. So basically here, your takeaway should be, when you have more than one objective, number them for easy reference. Refer to the objectives when describing the assessments. All of the objectives need to be assessed. Otherwise, if you're not assessing it, then it's a learning activity. So if you get ready to write something like the learner will read chapter 2, think, am I assessing that? Because it could be that what you're wanting to write down as an objective is actually just an activity. Modifications of the assessment. That doesn't mean that you have to create a different assessment for all of your students. Most of the time, what you want to be thinking about is, how can I help them with the assessment that's in front of them? Here's another really good example. Here, this student has really added in a great amount of detail, even thinking about what might be said, and then talking about how it would work out. This amount of detail is really exceptional and shows very, very good work. This student's not just thinking about what her students are going to be doing, but she's thinking about how she's going to look at that and be able to draw conclusions about their level of mastery. Again, this person has done a great job thinking outside the box when it comes to modifications. She's talking about things that she does in order to ensure that they're going to be successful in taking their assessment. So give a thorough description of your assessment, not just what the students will do, but how the teacher will use it for an evaluation of mastery. And here's our last example. What I really like about this one is that this person, as you can see, it's very easy to read because they've bolded and they've added in not just how to assess these objectives and related skills, which don't worry about related skills yet. That comes in later when you're writing your EdTPA. But your prior knowledge, in order to assess prior knowledge, in order to assess the vocabulary, to assess the objectives. So she's really, really giving a lot of evidence of alignment here. I love this. In order to assess the student's ability to apply what they've learned to the real world. Holy mackerel, that's what we're all about. So that's fantastic. She remembered, which a lot of students forget, to separate formative and summative. And in here, you can't really see it very well, but she's explaining to the class that they will be working on writing this essay that's going to be coming at the end. And again, she's talking about different groups, how she's going to shorten the writing assignment, and then she's going to provide some sentence stems to help students who might be having trouble with the debate she's got planned. So basically, you want to make sure that you label for formative and summative assessments, even though we don't do it up here. You do want to do it down here. And remember, of course, that the summatives don't happen in every lesson, but you should be thinking about what's coming up. Use bolding to make the evidence easier to find. Think about other things that you could assess besides the lesson objectives. And I did want to point out, and I put this here so I wouldn't forget, that she included, even thought about early finishers when she's thinking about her different learners. So that's kind of how you need to think out of the box, not just 504 IEP. That's too easy. So you have an assignment in your module about writing these objectives into um, and the objectives and the assessments. So these are the directions. I do want you to write more than one objective. You're going to make sure that you number your objectives. You're going to create at least one informal and one formal assessment for each objective. You need to reference the objective that's being assessed with the sentence starter in order to assess objective 1, 2, 3, whatever. Include details in your descriptions. Make subcategories for formative and summative in your formal assessment section. Describe the summative assessment that is in the future that students are working towards. Bold your headings. And don't forget to include modifications. Remember, no one is exempt from completing that section on modifications. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to these directions and this instruction today. It will help you in your performance, not just in our assignment, but in the future when you write lesson plans in Residency 1 for your supervisor. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.